You are listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
I'm standing in front of the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel in central Paris. Built to commemorate Napoleon's military victories of 1815, it stood as a gateway to the Tuileries Palace, the imperial residence, and was an elaborate statement of the emperor's power. I can see the bas-reliefs in rose marble which depict some of his greatest victories, the Battle of Austerlitz, the Austrian surrender at Ulm, and Napoleon entering Munich and Vienna. Napoleon is often accused of being the principal warmonger of his age. However, in this programme, I want to argue that this view of him is partly mistaken. Of course, he was no pacifist, but in fact, war was declared on him far more often than he declared it on others. European monarchs formed no fewer than 7 coalitions against France in the revolutionary and Napoleonic period. Since 1793, France had been determined to export the values and ideals of the revolution to the rest of Europe. The French felt themselves to be on a civilising mission, offering a new design for living to other Europeans, although, of course, the prerequisite for that was unchallenged French military might. According to Napoleon,
there must be a superior power which dominates all the other powers with enough authority to force them to live in harmony with one another. And France is best placed for that purpose.
In my view, Napoleon did bring genuine enlightenment to peoples who, without his army's victories, would have remained without rights and equality before the law. He abolished the Inquisition, obscure and often feudal practices, institutional anti-Semitism, and so on. By 1800, at its height, Napoleon's empire counted over 44 million subjects across Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe. But his empire was a first-generation construct and only 6 years old. For the dynasty to survive, he needed a son. After 13 years of trying, his wife Josephine hadn't produced one. The idea that Napoleon's first marriage was some great Romeo and Juliet love story is another myth which I'd like to dispel. Napoleon married Josephine in March 1796 in Paris, an undeniably sexy femme fatale in her mid-30s. Josephine had needed a protector and provider. As an ambitious general, he valued her political connections, her social status as a vicomtesse, and the way she compensated for his own lack of savoir-faire and social graces. Napoleon was initially infatuated with his new wife, but she was more interested in her new lover, Hippolyte Charles. That was Josephine's last transgression. Though when Napoleon found out about it, he took the first of a string of 22 mistresses. Then politics intervened. After conquering Austria at the Battle of Wagram in 1810, a new kind of Franco-Austrian relationship was needed to prevent further outbreaks of war. This could be achieved if Napoleon were to divorce Josephine and marry the Emperor Francis's daughter, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, the great-niece of Marie Antoinette. On the 30th of November 1810, Napoleon told Josephine he wanted an annulment.
You have children. I have none. You must feel the necessity that lies upon me of strengthening my dynasty.
I've now walked through the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel and into the eastern end of the Tuileries Gardens. When Napoleon and the Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria married, their wedding cortege passed through here on the 2nd of April 1810. The continent's oldest and newest dynasties had united, though he admitted years later,
I think although I loved Marie-Louise very sincerely, that I loved Josephine better. That was natural, we had risen together. She was full of grace, graceful even in the way she prepared herself for bed, graceful in undressing herself. I should never have parted from her if she had borne me a son. Ma foi.
Nevertheless, it did turn out to be a happy marriage, and 10 months later, at 8 a.m. on Wednesday the 20th of March 1811, Napoleon Francois-Joseph Charles was born.
My son is big and healthy. I hope that he will grow up well. He has my chest, my mouth, and my eyes. I trust that he will fulfill his destiny.
But Napoleon would later regret choosing an Austrian bride over a Russian one.
Assuredly, but for my marriage with Marie, I never should have made war on Russia. But I felt certain of the support of Austria, and I was wrong, for Austria is the natural enemy of France.
And so to Napoleon's ill-fated Russian campaign. Crucially, on the last day of 1810, Tsar Alexander published a decree stating that Russian trade would be open to neutral countries and that certain French Empire luxury goods would be banned, while others, such as wine, would be subjected to heavy import duties. The decree was in direct contravention to Napoleon's continental system, which Russia had agreed to adopt in the peace treaty of 1807. This was an embargo banning all trade and correspondence with Britain. No ships coming directly from Britain or the British colonies could be received in any port. British subjects automatically became prisoners of war and their possessions were seized.
It's the only means of striking a blow to England and obliging her to make peace.
For the Emperor believed that Britain couldn't simultaneously afford
the occupation of India, the war against America, the establishments in the Mediterranean, defending Ireland and its own coasts, the garrisoning of the huge navy, and at the same time the stubborn war against us in the peninsula.
Perhaps the most commonplace criticism of Napoleon is that in deciding to invade Russia in 1812, he was suffering from some kind of Napoleon complex, a hubristic desire to rule the world at no matter what cost to his soldiers and subjects. This is rubbish. Napoleon himself certainly didn't want to go to war against Russia. He had no territorial aspirations there. He merely wanted to force the Tsar to go back to honouring the economic blockade commitments. And he had beaten the Russians roundly twice before. On the 15th of August 1811, Alexander Kurakin, the Russian ambassador, was confronted by Napoleon at the Emperor's birthday reception here at the Tuileries Palace. Conflict could be avoided, he said, if there were a new Franco-Russian alliance. Kurakin said he had no powers to negotiate any such thing. On the 24th of June 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen into Russia, starting the War of the Sixth Coalition. The Emperor's bulletin to the Grande Armée proclaimed,
"Soldiers, Russia swore an eternal alliance with France and war with England. Today she violates her oaths. She places us between dishonour and war. The choice cannot be in doubt. Let us cross the Niemen. The peace which you shall conclude shall put an end to the baneful influence which Russia has for 50 years exercised over the affairs of Europe."
Napoleon had an army of 615,000 men, the largest invasion force in history, the same size as the population of Paris, and twice the size of the Russian forces opposing him. But he had no intention of going deep into the Russian interior. He knew about the extreme Russian winters and only wanted to go 50 miles in a 20-day campaign. He certainly wasn't expecting to march over 700 miles from the Niemen to Moscow. But as the French army advanced, the Russians steadily retreated, offering Napoleon no decisive battle, and recognising the war was going to be as much about logistics as battles, the Russians systematically burned and destroyed everything as they beat a path back towards Moscow. Napoleon never anticipated this extraordinary level of scorched earth defence. In the end, the Russians even burnt down 2/3 of Moscow.
This was an event on which I could not calculate, as there is not, I believe, a precedent for it in the history of the world. But, by God, one has to admit that it showed a hell of a strength of character.
Napoleon failed to destroy the Russian army, so capturing Moscow was no guarantee of Tsar Alexander's surrender. The French army left Moscow on the 18th of October 1812, but a week later Napoleon made a grave error over which route to take back to Smolensk. The retreat slowed to a crawl, with the weather dropping to -30 through seemingly continuing blizzards. 5,000 horses died in a matter of days. Men's lips stuck together, nostrils froze, and they were afflicted with snow blindness. Comradeship collapsed. Men charged a gold louis to sit by the fire, declined to share any food or water, ate the horses' forage, robbed the dying, drove wagons over men who had fallen down in front of them. According to the French officer Eugène Labaume,
the army utterly lost its morale and its military organization. Tormented by hunger, they rushed on every horse as soon as it fell, and like famished wolves, fought for the pieces.
the Russians adopted a strategy of harrying Napoleon out of Russia, marching almost parallel to him and attacking whenever they saw weakness, but refusing Napoleon the opportunity of any decisive counterattack. But in total, Russian military action accounted for just over 38% of the 500,000 losses that Napoleon's army sustained in Russia. Typhus, starvation, exposure and suicide accounted for the rest. In late 1812, Tsar Alexander made this observation about Napoleon.
What a career he has ruined. Having gained so much glory, he could bestow peace on Europe, and he has not done so. The spell is broken.
On the 18th of October 1813, the Allies defeated the French army at the Battle of Leipzig in Saxony and set their sights here on Paris. Napoleon attempted to recreate the old patriotism of the Revolution, even allowing street musicians to play the hitherto banned Republican anthem, the Marseillaise. But the old cry of La Patrie en danger no longer had its electrifying effect. The French people hankered for peace. On the 30th of March 1814, around 57,000 Allied troops attacked Montmartre and the other Parisian suburbs. There were 41,000 French soldiers left to defend it. Yet despite knowing that Napoleon was on his way, those he left in charge considered the situation irretrievable and succumbed to the Allies' threats to destroy Paris. They opened talks with a view to surrendering the city, which happened at 7 a.m. the next morning. 15 years after supporting Napoleon's coup d'etat, the politician Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand launched his own and set up a provisional government. At 6 p.m, Tsar Alexander of Russia arrived here at the Hôtel de Talleyrand on the Rue Saint-Florentin, which is now part of the American Embassy. This became the Allies' headquarters. Talleyrand persuaded them to adopt Louis XVIII as the legitimate ruler rather than a Bonaparte. Napoleon abdicated unconditionally on the 11th of April, 1814. Any general must ultimately be judged by the outcome of his battles, and following the disastrous campaign in Russia and his forced abdication, Napoleon has often been portrayed as a failed warrior and a bungler. However, despite the huge losses sustained in Russia, I believe he was a military genius. Had he not made the crucial mistakes of invading Iberia and Russia, Napoleonic Europe might well have stabilised, bordered by the Niemen at one end and the English Channel at the other. But from the end of 1812, the monarchs of Ancien Régime Europe strained every resource to be rid of him. Following Napoleon's exile to Elba in 1814, they thought they'd succeeded. But as I will explain tomorrow, he would return.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.